This is Simran Whittam, game producer at TryHeart Interactive and co-founder of Manchester Gamers Unite, interviewing
Fernando Melo, producer at BioWare.
Cool Beans. So this is just a kind of informal interview really about the game producer role and what it is that a game producer does within the industry and about the role. So I'll go to my first question, which is what I ask every game producer who I speak to, and the answer is always different. What is a game producer, if you had to sum one up?
Yeah, there's a good reason why the answer is probably always different. I think it really depends on the studio. Usually a producer will be somewhat of a glue or a kind of a connective tissue between lots of different skill sets, and they'll kind of fill in sometimes a lot of gaps. So oftentimes the role will shift from sometimes being a project manager or being a product owner, in the sense of trying to figure out what sort of features the game should have. It could be kind of like a business owner, where you're responsible for working with external groups like marketing or publishers and things like that, and working on the actual packaging of the game, and everything from box art and localizations and all those kinds of things that you need to do. It could be more of a creative person working alongside a designer, or sometimes even as a designer, depending on the requirements and kind of skill sets that exist at the studio to actual design features or other aspects of the game. In some cases, you have very specific producer roles, like on larger teams, you might have producers owning things like cinematics or story or combat or other kind of feature or pillars of the title. So really broad. I think probably in terms of the most common ones, it tends to be helping to keep the direction of the team going and kind of getting everybody rowing in the same direction. And then usually that also involves the aspect of project management in terms of figuring out what are sort of the key dates, what do you want to get done in certain timeframes, and trying to get everybody moving towards that. So it can be kind of broad, and then it really depends on the studio as well. Sometimes you have studios that have already really strong disciplines in design and business and even project management. So for example, within Electronic Arts, we have a career track, which is a development director track, which is more of a project management. It's really people and time and budgets that those individuals would own. So the producers tend to be more, line producers, for example, tend to be more on the creative or product owner side of figuring out the what in terms of a feature, or depending on your seniority, the scope of what you're responsible for could be everything from just down to a feature or a specific team in the larger game team, all the way to the actual, maybe a game mode, like multiplayer, or the actual game itself when you get to sort of senior producer or executive producer level. So I'm not sure if that actually answers your question.
No, that answers. I've spoke to quite a few game producers, including Ryan Treadwell, and his answer was along those same lines. Kind of it's vastly different every single time.
Yeah, I think definitely being a little bit of a jack of all trades helps, and that's a big part too. Is depends on your own skill sets. We have sometimes you'll have folks in production that come from other disciplines first, or they come up through QA, where they might have been involved in a wide variety of different experiences before, everything from, again, design to art to helping out whatever teams they were working on, and then that too will help shape usually what kinds of things you take on.
Yeah, that seems to be a common route, because as I said, when I've spoken to other producers, they recommend that the QA route is one of the best routes into the job. And I've been working at 2 other companies on the side as well whenever I get the time, and QA, because the jobs are QA and usability, they recommend that as like the kind of the way into the production route of side of the games industry.
Yep. Yeah, it's one of those things that it'll give you a really nice breadth of experience, because typically you will get a view into all aspects of how a game gets put together. Even if you're not necessarily a an expert in a particular area. Like you wouldn't necessarily be a designer or a programmer or whatever, but from a QA perspective, you'll be working very closely with those individuals. You'll be seeing those things being developed over time and have a really good understanding of how that also plays into and ties together with other parts of the game. And I think that tends to help a lot. Again, as a producer, having a good overview of how a game gets made, things like understanding the production pipeline. So, once an individual on the team is done with their work, where does that go to? Who's the next person in line that needs to take that on? So, for example, if a character artist has finished building a model, then it might need to go to either, tech artist or tech animator to rig it, skin it. You have folks in animation that are working with that as well, and so forth. So just kind of having a good understanding of how those pipelines work. I think the QA role in particular, if you're a little bit of luck there too in terms of the studio that you end up working with, and hopefully having the opportunity to experience lots of different facets of the game and working with different teams, I think would be a huge asset in terms of moving into the production role eventually.
Well, means that kind of answers the first question then, because there's quite a few here, so I don't want to bore you with them all.
Sure, no worries.
What is the difference in responsibility between a AAA game producer such as yourself and an indie game producer such as me, someone who's working with a small team?
Well, probably the biggest difference is going to be just you, I think, would probably have a much better handle of what everyone on the team is doing. Whereas with larger teams, you tend to, it's just not really possible to know what every single person is up to every single day. So there's a lot more in terms of sort of the communication aspect tends to be more of trying to paint the picture of where things need to go. Excuse me. And then trying to make sure that everyone is unblocked in terms of moving in that direction. And I think there's a lot of that with the indie aspect as well. But I think one of the advantages is even if you're not physically co-located, you probably will have daily stand-ups or things like that, and it would seem closer to working with one or maybe a couple smaller scrum teams if you're using something like Agile, to kind of always just be aware day to day where people are at, what's blocking them, working on keeping them moving forward. I think the other aspect of it is you would probably have sort of singular oversight in terms of what features might get made or not, even if you're working collaboratively with the rest of the team to kind of figure out what is the right thing for your game. But usually on the AAA side, there are very kind of high-level pillars for what you want to do, what you want to build, and then you work with leads across the various disciplines and teams to kind of make sure that all the pieces that are needed for those things are getting done. But again, it's usually not possible to kind of be directly involved with every single one of those things. You have to you work through documentation, you work through meetings, and you kind of entrust that a lot of people are working towards that larger pillar, towards that larger goal. So I would say that that's probably the largest difference. The other aspect, of course, is usually with AAA you have a lot of other entities that you have to deal with, whether that's so for example, for us specifically as part of Electronic Arts, we deal with a lot of central teams. A lot of our shared technology is actually being done by other groups, so you don't own every single thing yourself on the project. We use Frostbite, which is a different team. We have online services that is built by a different team. So a lot of those things as well is, again, just kind of day-to-day management of understanding what their roadmaps look like and trying to convey what your game needs and make sure that that's in their roadmap, and when you're going to launch, make sure that they're all aligned with the same kind of goals and dates and things like that that you need. So it tends to be probably a lot more of sort of plate spinning, I guess, because there's a much larger set of things that you have to look after. Whereas I suspect on the indie side with a smaller team, I think it would feel closer to just managing one of the teams on something like a Dragon Age or a Mass Effect, where you can be really just focused on what that team is trying to produce, what their backlog looks like, and that's probably your number one priority, is just keeping that team productive and moving forward and unblocked all the time.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it works with us. It's my job to pretty much keep the team working on what it is and make sure we're hitting our key milestones and development milestones. So our third question is, what are the responsibilities of a game producer? But I think you may have already covered that in your previous question, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, again, given our first question and that there's such a wide range of things that you might be responsible for, I think at a kind of like a higher level, I guess, probably the main thing is keeping your team focused, keeping them moving forward towards a kind of unified goal, keeping people motivated. So again, there's challenges, as you know, I'm sure. Every single day there's surprises that may come up. There's things that you thought were going to be easy that are not. There's tech issues, there's all kinds of other stuff. So trying to kind of keep people positive and finding workarounds and finding, in a lot of cases, compromises where there is no good solution. Someone is going to have to bear the burden of the decision, whether it's like, oh, this means more work for design, or this means more work for programming to solve it this way. But that's the right thing for the project, and getting people on board with that and moving forward and stuff. I think that's definitely one of the big pieces to it.
That sounds very, very familiar. we just had to deal with that for the build of the game we revealed at MGU on Tuesday, and last minute programming issues. It was beautiful.
Demos are, I mean, that's kind of the par for the course, I suppose, with demos. No good demo goes without some sort of a hitch. No matter how much planning and how many times you try it and all that kind of stuff ahead of time, there's something always that comes up.
All it was really was I don't think I've told you the game, have I? That we're working
no,
on.
I don't think so.
I'll go into a bit of detail about it later, but basically it was the player could hover forever if they just double-clicked the jump button, and we completely we oversaw this massive programming error, and everyone on the build was just clicking the double jump button and holding it forever, and it was just like, oh, brilliant.
That sounds like a feature, actually.
Yeah. Well, we actually figured about incorporating it into the jetpack now, so that'll work. That could work out, really.
So interestingly, like that's actually one of the really cool things about having other people play the game.
Well, that's the point.
And getting feedback and stuff is understanding.
That's kind of the point of MGU for the game devs, so that they can get feedback on their stuff and talk to the games and see what it is that they do and don't like about stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes you do discover those things, right? As you're playing it, these unintended consequences end up being something that is just really fun, and people really gravitate towards that. And all of a sudden, you think, okay, well, I guess we should probably find a home for this and figure out how to make this into an actual thing as part of the game. So that's good. That's good.
So yeah, fourth question is, I'll try and blitz through some of these. There's only a couple more after this one. Because this was something I spoke to with Ryan Treadwell about, that he went into quite a bit of detail about that I was unaware of with the game producer role, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit further on this. Within the role of game producer, could you explain the importance of hard skills and soft skills within the role of a game producer at a game studio such as BioWare?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, typically when we talk about hard skills, it tends to be craft or creative skills. So actual programming, actual design, actual art, those kinds of things tend to be skills that you could learn perhaps through tutorials or through books or those kinds of things. And of course through experience. Soft skills tend to be, we also call them people skills. These are more working with individuals, trying to understand, as we were talking about earlier, like how to, what drives people, what makes them happy, what are their buttons, to avoid pushing. Especially what motivates individuals is really important. There is no kind of one size fits all way of dealing with individuals. Everyone is different. Someone that normally is perfectly happy all the time may have, a personal issue, and they're coming into work and now they're upset about something, and it's got nothing to do with the game per se, but it's interfering with them that day, or how they're dealing with other individuals, and trying to understand that. So usually the soft skills part is important from a producer, because a lot of it, one of the other things that we often talk about is you tend to only really manage through influence. As a producer, it really doesn't matter that you have the title. It doesn't matter that you're kind of coming in as like, oh, you are the product owner for this feature. And on one hand, that kind of means technically the buck should sort of stop with you, and you get to make sort of final decisions. But really, one of the quickest ways to kind of kill any sort of engagement from the team and have people disengage is if you're very authoritative in terms of how you handle decision making and things like that. So part of the managing through influence is trying to kind of figure out what is the consensus, making sure that you're getting input from various leads, especially folks that are impacted through whatever that decision is going to be. And then trying to also not just make a decision and say, this is what I want, I don't care about what you guys think, but rather, even if there is disagreement, to kind of paint a picture and show a little bit of the math behind or context around why you think this decision is the right one for the product. That's actually kind of the underlining thing. You hope, again, hiring the right people, etc. The expectation is everyone that's there is actually after the exact same thing. No matter their discipline, no matter their individual motivations and things like that, everyone is there to make an awesome game experience. So as long as you can, if you can find a way to ground decisions, even conflicting decisions and things, not conflicting decisions, but conflicting compromises and things like that, if you can ground it in, this is why this is going to make the game better, or why this is important for players, that usually helps, because fundamentally that's what everyone is trying to do. So you'll find, folks that may not have agreed with, that wasn't their opinion or their choice. If you can kind of help to paint that picture, that helps a lot. So that's typically what we kind of encompass when we say things like soft skills, is really the people management aspect of it, and helping to kind of keep the team focused and united in what they're trying to build.
Cool beans. That sounds good. So the next question is, could you go? So this was something else that we got mentioned in the last interview I did, which we don't really know much about, and I was wondering just if I could get your perspective on it. Is could you go into detail about game dev interviews at all, like for the role of game producer, and how those kind of work?
You mean the interviewing process for hiring?
Yeah. So kind of like how does it work and how to prepare for it, because there's like virtually no information on like how to prepare for a game dev interview, and Ryan Treadwell made it out as if though it was like an obstacle course, and through the idiot check, and that there's endless tests and stuff like that. It made it sound like a gauntlet. I was just curious what your perspective was on them.
Yeah, again, I mean, it does obviously vary from company to company. Usually, and I can speak to sort of BioWare EA and my past experience with other studios, by far the biggest thing that you're looking for is someone to fit in with the culture and the team that you already have. That would be the most catastrophic sort of hiring mistake, would be you bring someone in that completely disrupts the team, sets everyone off, and all that kind of stuff. So you're better off ultimately hiring someone that you think has some potential, but has a good fit with the folks that are there. So a lot of the interviewing questions, and again, I'm speaking, this is true for, I believe, all positions, but especially with sort of producers, where you will be interacting with lots of different disciplines and so forth, or any kind of production, also project management and so forth. I think that's definitely one of the things. A lot of the questions are going to be around scenarios. So tell me about a time when something bad happened and how you dealt with it. or what was something that you felt really proud about what you worked on before, and why? How did you deal with, this type of a decision or this sort of conflict, or how do you deal with, providing feedback to an artist or a designer or a programmer or those kinds of things. If you've done it before, I mean, those kinds of things, you'll have good experiences, hopefully, to kind of draw upon and be able to do that. If this is your first interview or your first time kind of jumping into that sort of role, then really look for, and again, the interviewer should be aware of that anyways going into it, and it should be tailoring those questions around your past experience. But draw from school experience if you're working on projects. Everyone's had projects where you have people that are really good to work with, and then you have people that probably are not super cooperative and haven't done anything on it. And those are good to be able to kind of call out, like, if you were working on that team, then how did you feel, and what did you do about it, and how did you do about it? How did you go about trying to change that? Those are important answers that people would be looking for to get a sense of how you handle conflict and working with different personality types and things like that. Does that help?
Yeah, that pretty much sounds like the interview the 2 interviews I went with for the 2 companies that I've been doing QA and usability for. The questions were kind of really tailored about those kind of production questions of how you would spot something and how you would deal with this situation. How would you make sure someone would find out that this is this, and how would you go about reporting this in the right way?
Yeah, and again, I think from a production perspective, I would expect it to focus more on, again, those soft skills like we talked about. In terms of hard skill questions, it would depend on your background. If you're coming from a design position and you wanted to move into that, or a programming position, there may be questions around that. And in particular, why the change? What is it about, the role change that you're interested in? But for the most part, that would probably be a lot of the questions would be around that. The other part as well is, again, for games, you're definitely looking for people that love games and that understand, even if you don't have a lot of experience, but the difference between just kind of playing a game for fun, and really the flip side of trying to deconstruct it and understand what is fun about it, what made it fun, what wasn't fun about it. Those are good to kind of get a sense of. On your own, have you already started to kind of sort of try to peek behind the curtain as to how certain decisions got made, or why certain game mechanics work, or in some cases the quality or execution of it just wasn't there, and being able to articulate and understand, even if you don't understand it, but being able to recognize that and articulate that is also really good skills to have as you're starting off in a production role.
Cool beans. So the question following that was, and this is a bit of a breath one, this one. What is the best way to utilize a producer at the beginning of a game project? When a company or team get together to make a game, what should be the first thing a game producer is set at the beginning of the project and throughout it?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. So by far at the beginning of the project, or beginning of the game, the main thing that you want to try to figure out before you really start having people kind of barreling along a path is you need to really understand what it is that you want to make. So that could be, depending on the scale of the team and what you're trying to achieve. It could be that you already have a vision of what you want to make, or maybe it's a genre that excites you or something along those lines, but there's probably kind of cardinal direction that you're interested in moving towards. The next step I would say is getting everybody, making sure that everyone is on board with that direction and feels the same way, or at least is not trying to go in a different direction. So even if it's, you want to make a fighting game and your lead programmer hates fighting games, then you probably need to just at least ensure that he's or she is excited at the prospect of at least putting the game together and solving the technical challenges that are there, even if it's not their kind of main type of game that they enjoy. But by far, it would be a lot more helpful if everyone is also really excited about making that style of game. The next step, I would say, is looking at lots of those kinds of games. And ideally, if you can do it as a team, or at least with your kind of core leads or the most significant team members that you have, design and so forth, to play other games in that space. And again, come to sort of a consensus of what makes those games fun. What is the audience for that game expecting? Now, in some cases, you may already have a vision where you're like going back to the example of the fighting game. You want to make a fighting game that is not like other fighting games. Then I think in that case, you need to have a kind of clear vision, or at least with your lead designer, whoever that is, which could be you as well, but of what is going to be different about it and why you think that's going to be cool and fun for players. And ultimately, you want to get to, once you have a vision that I think is a little bit more kind of crystallized as to, we think this is going to be really, really cool. You've tossed ideas about it, you've written them down, you put them on a whiteboard, you've drawn some doodles to get excited about it. You slept on it. 2 days later, you go back to that, and everybody's still super stoked about it. Then I think the next step is you really need to start putting together something like a very quick prototype of what is different in that example, or at the very least, what are kind of the key pillars for the game. So from a fighting game, there's some very specific things that you want to be able to do. You could take existing stuff that's out there, like if you're using Unity or whatever the case is, you can maybe get something from the asset store just to get something stood up super, super quick, and then just start playing with it, getting some feedback on it. Throw in whatever your unique thing that you wanted to do, your fighting game, but it doesn't have this, or it has this other thing, and get that stood up somehow very, very quickly, and then just get some feedback on it. So is it, the 3 or 4 of you is kind of core leads, are super excited about it, but then you get someone else that typically plays those games, and they look at it and they're like, this is really boring, or I don't like it, or whatever the case is, and start getting some feedback on it and understand what is, why are they not seeing this is the next really awesome thing the way that you see it, and then start to make some decisions off of it. So I would say at the very start, again, it's getting everyone aligned on what the vision is. Make sure that folks are not just everyone's just kind of going off in their own direction of what they think a cool thing could be. And then working towards getting that stood up as quickly as possible so you can actually get other people's feedback, and make sure, kind of reinforce that the direction that you want to go in really is as cool and interesting as you think it can be. And then if that's successful, then you can continue through starting to build up the rest of the production plan. What do you need? Do you need a dozen fighters that you can select, dozen characters you can select, and they have different moves, so what should those be? And like all that stuff is way down the line if you pass that initial kind of stage of, yes, this is really the game we should be making.
Cool beans. So the following question after that is another big one. How would you, as a producer, recommend to a small indie producer like me how to go about ensuring a game is shipped into the hands of consumers? What type of people should I be aiming to contact when I start approaching the point of our game reaching a gold state, or when we're aiming at getting our game in the hands of our audiences?
That is a really good question. So specifically as an indie team and as an indie producer, and this is because, again, I'm not in that space. I'm sort of extrapolating, and from what I'm seeing, a lot of other indie teams are doing, I think, successfully, and is working for them. I think by far the biggest thing is don't wait until you have a gold version. I think what you're doing with in Manchester there, I think, is a really good start, getting in the hands of players as early as possible. There's some, obviously there's, I think a lot more opportunity in terms of whether it's not necessarily Steam's greenlight anymore, but there's kind of early access opportunities out there to get players involved and getting feedback. I think definitely attending various shows as much as you can. Being there in person, this is true even on the AAA side. Nothing beats watching people play your game in person. Which again, if you go through something like Greenlight or some sort of early access program, you don't necessarily get that. You'll get a sense of numbers, you'll get a sense of feedback. You might have telemetry and things that you could analyze to ensure things are balanced and that kind of stuff. But it's not quite the same as actually watching people play the game, have those exhilarating moments that you expected them to have, run into frustrations that you didn't think that they would, get confused at a menu option or what they should do next. Like those kinds of things are hugely invaluable. And then I think once you're actually ready to, you now have lots of good feedback, people are excited about the game, you're starting to get to the point of, okay, now we just got to finish this thing and get it out. I think at that point, if not a little bit earlier, start talking or start reaching out to where do you want to, where are you going to publish this thing? That could be just self-publishing, again, through Steam, other platforms, also depending on which platforms you're actually on. And then I would also start considering reaching out to, there's a couple organizations that handle things like PR, marketing and so forth, specifically for indie games. Even if you end up not going with one of them, I think it's probably worth having a couple of conversations and just getting a sense of what they could provide you and what that would cost you, or how those deals would get structured, to get a sense of, is it worth it for the kind of game that you're making, or do you think you can do that yourself? The other thing is reach out to other indies. One of the things that I've, again, as an outsider kind of looking in, I do tend to play indie games and stuff, and I really enjoy that, and I follow quite a few people. I find that the indie scene is highly supportive of itself. So finding an opportunity to get that, and even inviting other folks that you kind of admire and you like their games and so forth, to invite them to play your game and give you some feedback, I think that would be hugely helpful. And just starting to get the word out there. That could be, again, you wearing, as a producer, you tack on one more hat, which is your communications or kind of PR hat, and you're working with fans in social media and forums, and getting them excited about it and getting them involved. You're reaching out to other peers in the industry and getting their feedback, and also just kind of getting a sense of their own experiences through launching their games. I think one of the things that you could do is start asking some of them what was really good, what would they do different this time around, if they could kind of go back and redo their launch experience, what would they have changed? And I think that would be very helpful. Certainly kind of better firsthand experience than anything I can tell you. And then ultimately, in terms of depending on whether your game has online components or not, definitely, make sure that you have everything in place for that. Make sure you've tested it out, you stress tested it. You have an idea of how you want to escalate issues if something really bad happens. What happens in that case? Who do you reach out to? You have those points of contact handy. You're making them aware that you're launching a game, so they're not surprised, whoever your partners are in terms of providing bandwidth and whatever else, hosting and things like that. Or if you're using third-party services for your back end and stuff. You'd be surprised how many pieces there are there, and it's very easy to forget to let everyone know. It seems obvious, but it sometimes you forget to remind folks, like, hey, just as a reminder, next week is the week, and make sure you got all your stuff ready and all that kind of stuff. Here's how you reach me if you see something, and so forth. So there's a lot of those kinds of things, but specifically on the business side, I would suggest don't worry too much until you're in full production. Once you're at that point and you have an idea of roughly when you think you would be ready to start filing the game, I would say start putting the wheels in motion to reaching out within your peers and to publishing partners, whether that's self-publishing, regardless of, like, make sure you got all your pieces in place, you know what the process looks like, and you've talked to other folks that have gone through that and used that platform. Find out, what were the pain points and things like that.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that one. That was really, really helpful. So, next question. What would your advice be for me right now, someone who has just gained the role of game producer within a small established indie team working on their first game?
Just any general advice?
Yeah, sure. Just consider. I'm green to the role now. I'm pretty much green now. This is my first game producer gig. What would your advice be, other than don't screw up?
Well, I mean, making mistakes is part of learning, right? I would say I've learned the most from whenever there are mistakes in difficult projects. You tend to learn a lot more from those things. So it's not a bad thing, but more practically, I think if I understand where you guys are at right now, I think the biggest thing by far is make sure that there is a unified vision. Everyone agrees and accepts that is the thing that we're going after. Make sure that they're unblocked. That's probably the biggest thing. Especially the smaller the team, you can actually get really good velocity from a small team if they're focused and they're unblocked. But the flip side is, if something comes up where someone is struggling or they hit a snag, you could be looking at 25% of your team is now not on track anymore, and that's a huge impact on the team if you have one person or one or two people. So making sure that you're staying in touch with them. If you, I don't know if you're physically co-located or if you're just remote, but making sure that every single day you have a sense of things are still in progress, what are the issues they're running into, that kind of stuff, and working really hard to unblock and keep them moving forward. Trying to stay one step ahead. That's easier said than done, but again, in the spirit of keeping people productive, in a lot of ways, the train is moving and it's hopefully picking up steam, and you're trying to lay down track in a direction that avoids mountains and trees and other obstacles along the way, and is still kind of moving in the direction of your goal. So it's important that you always have that one piece of track at least ahead of where the train is at. So wherever they're at right now, trying to understand what is the next step that you would have to solve for. Maybe it's a risk that's been identified and we need to figure out how do we go and tackle this thing, or how do we solve this. Maybe it's some technology that you need to evaluate, some additional tool or plugin or whatever it is, and you need to start working on that. So those kinds of things is important to try to get a sense of what is next and try to get ahead of that so it doesn't impact the team as well.
Okay. So the next question after that would be, so I understand if you can't answer this one, because this is the one question I was on about that was more related to you, but so
sure.
What was your role as game producer on Mass Effect Andromeda and Dragon Age? And if you had to sum up all your jobs, tasks and responsibilities and stuff like that you did for the games, what would you say they are, that you're allowed to talk about, of course?
Wow, it's a lot. I think the first question kind of summed it up. It's a mixed bag of stuff on any given day, but for Dragon Age, so on Dragon Age Origins, when I first came on, I actually started working with the animation and cinematics team. So at the time, that was figuring out pipeline. It was doing mocap shootings and all that kind of stuff, and make sure that we have enough people to build all the animations that we needed for all the creatures and characters and all those kinds of things. And then I quickly moved into a few months after that into the online role, which is actually what I was coming in for. And that was more, so again, Origins was not didn't have multiplayer or anything like that, but it did have these connected features. You needed an account. It was our first time working with EA, because during the development was when BioWare was acquired. So we had to kind of figure out all that side of things. We had a bunch of features around how do we deliver DLC, and even if it was through the toolset, so additional content. We also had the public toolset on PC. So it's figuring those things out. So it's more around deciding what were the features, evaluating whether we can actually build them, are they worthwhile building, and can we build them? And then content-wise, in terms of the DLC, what were we going to make available, what team we needed for it, and so forth. Fast forward through DA2, similar thing, so kind of working on the post-ship. Once the game shipped, then essentially the full team moved on to the next game, or at least starting to ideate on what the next game should be. So I actually ended up doing a lot of the, essentially running the game, as it were, the previous game. So all of the patching, content, figuring out, working with the community team and answering things on forums and getting feedback through there, doing helping to promote it, so going to various shows and talking about the game and those kinds of things. Same with DA2. Then I did 4 years as the director of online development, where I was working on all our games and helping to do a lot of the common online features and back-end services and things that all of our games needed. A lot of the out-of-game experience stuff. So for DAI, that was things like the Dragon Age Keep and those kinds of things. And then fast forward into Mass Effect, where I came back kind of to do a similar role to what I had before as an online producer. So Mass Effect that came on was about 1.5 years before we shipped. So already there was quite a lot in place. It wasn't as much as figuring out features and things like that, although there was a few that we ended up adding or changing. But a lot of it was more, here's the box, how do we finish this box, the sandbox, and that's what you have to play with. How do we finish this, get it out, and so forth. So Mass Effect was kind of it was quite a big game, and it was spread out between the 3 studios, 3 BioWare studios, including Austin had folks helping out as well, and of course Edmonton. And then the game was largely divided up between, you've probably read some of the things that have gone out already about the game development, things like that. It didn't have, there was quite a few leadership changes, so it didn't have an executive producer per se, like we typically do, our project director. So a lot of the game was kind of divided up into 3 producers, with Mike Gamble and Fabrice Condaminis and myself. So I kind of handled the online multiplayer aspect of it. So really that was more figuring out, what is the content and what is the features around multiplayer and online, making sure that we balanced, that we could actually build that, and it was balanced against what the needs of the single player experience was, which is what the other guys were looking after, and then helping to kind of, in terms of when we were doing things like our bug triages and stuff as the game was winding down, helping to make priority calls as to where do we invest our remaining time. Do you go and fix this thing, or do you go and fix that thing? Is this bug serious enough for us to address versus these other ones, which requires the exact same people, that kind of stuff. And that was across the board for the whole game. And then on the multiplayer side specifically, it was in the lead up to launch, it was going through things like the online services, making sure everything's in place, and the various central groups and external teams were all in place to do that stuff. It was also working with the app team for the Apex HQ app, make sure that was in place for what we needed. And then going through the launch of the game, where we kind of set up what we call the war room, which is essentially it was a room, one in each of the studios, and then we were connected through video conferencing. I ended up, I think, tweeting some pictures of it and things like that. So we had a pretty good setup. We could see like all the game telemetry coming in. We had a few screens that were dedicated to things like Twitch, so we could see players playing the game as well live. We could monitor the various teams within EA and so forth. You could monitor things like how many people are playing the game, how many people are in matches, what is the time between players getting into matches, and like all sorts of the healthy metrics that you want to be aware of. It was also kind of the central hub for all the issues, literally, like everything from all the support teams around the world, marketing teams, social media, our own developers. Like we had essentially set up kind of a hotline and an email address and a Slack channel that people, if you see someone struggling or if you run into an issue, just ping us on this and tell us what it is. And then all of that came in, and it was again a big, similar to our bug process, a big triage. You go through that stuff, you prioritize it, and then you try to address as much as you can into the next patch in the time you have, and then putting that together. Whatever doesn't get into that patch just gets moved on to the next one, and you just keep going through that. And we're still doing that. We had a recent patch, I think, at the end of July. One of the other guys was looking after that while I was out. We still have content, so for the multiplayer side, we moved away from doing multiplayer DLCs and actually just put them as part of the patches themselves. Big reason for that is we saw with Mass Effect 3 and the multiplayer DLCs, what ends up happening is not everyone, even if it's a free DLC, not everyone ends up downloading it, and then you can't play with other players, so it actually just fractures the community even more. Whereas with this, everyone gets it. It's part of the update. All 3 platforms, including PC, require you to go and grab the update if you want to play online. So that ensured that everyone always had the exact same, not just code, but also content. So even if you didn't get a particular character, weapon, or whatever the case is in a pack, you could still see other people with that content playing the game in your match and so forth. So that it wasn't like you couldn't connect with them or anything like that. So that was a lot of kind of the role of it, was helping, working with programming, with design, with art, with QA especially, in terms of figuring out what the focus was, at least for the remaining time that we had since I came on, prioritizing, content and features, in some cases cutting things that just were not going to make it in time. Usually most of those, again, would just be deferred to be considered for patching or future updates, and then we would triage it again when we got around to deciding what we're going to put into patches when we got to that. And then a lot of the sort of launch director role, I guess you'd call it, of coordinating with all the different groups, not just within BioWare, but EA and externally with partners as well. And then post-launch, it's again looking after prioritizing what goes into patches, and any remaining content and all that kind of stuff, and figuring out when to release that. And still looking at, the metrics of players. We still have our Twitch streams, which for the most part, I usually try to get the other team members to participate, and it's a good opportunity for them to kind of talk about what they've actually done and hear from fans and stuff. And then usually I'm on the chat, one, moderating, but then also it's a good way to kind of see questions and be able to answer questions and things like that. So
cool beans. That sounds really, really interesting, the community side of it.
Yep.
I'll just have to, I think my charger's good, my battery's going to run out. I'll just have to run and get the charger really, really quickly. I left it in the other room like a noob.
All good.
And we're back.
Yep, okay.
Yeah, I'll edit that little bit of awkward me leaving out. Yeah, there's only one more question anyway, so don't worry, we'll get this interview over and done with in a moment. So the final question is, on the business side of things, of being part of a group of devs / graduates such as myself. Well, I haven't graduated yet, I've got another year to go yet, but so as a part of a small group of devs who the majority have graduated, who have just set up an indie studio and working on a first game, what areas of business would you recommend we look at with our business structure whilst we are starting out doing this for the first time?
That's a good question.
If you know about that sort of stuff anyway.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't had to deal a lot with that directly. Most of the business stuff on our end, again, being part of EA, we don't necessarily need to go out and seek our own funding or any of that kind of stuff, of course, so it's a little bit different. But I would suggest definitely looking at, again, reach out through your peers within the industry, figure out what's worked for them, how they have solved some of those challenges as well. I mean, traditionally you always have publishing. You could kind of shop that around to different publishers and try to get a deal which would include, usually it would include things like some sort of payments for as you're progressing through the game and so forth, and that would help to kind of float things a little bit. Obviously you can look at private investment as well. There are a few funds out there. It may be a little bit challenging because there's a lot of, obviously as you can expect, there's a lot of demand for that, a lot of interest in that, so there's a lot of competition for those kinds of things. The other aspect as well is I know that there is at least 1 or 2 platforms that are specific to funding games. So you have things like Fig that was set up by some of the folks at Double Fine, I believe, and they have a structure where it is crowdfunding, but they also allow folks to invest in the game itself, which is a slightly different way of doing the crowdfunding. You could try to reach them out. There's another one that I just saw recently, and the name escapes me right now. I could dig it up and I'll kind of send it to you, but there are starting to appear, I think, a few funds or at least investment groups that are gearing themselves specifically for games. The other aspect, of course, is you can always try to do Kickstarters or something along those lines. Again, the challenge there is the sheer number of them and how to stand out above the crowd. But again, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, but it is, the challenge is a slightly different thing at that point.
That is something we've actually been looking at, and we have developed a way to kind of around that. I'm more than happy to go into it with you once this is done. Kind of tell you you like how we're planning on going through our route through it.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah, not interrupt you anyway, feel free to resume.
Yeah, the other thing as well is there's a few, well, there's lots, but there's a few in particular industry conferences that also provide kind of meet and greet, specific like Casual Connect and things like that. And both at GDC and like Gamescom is coming up, those kinds of things. If you have the funds to be able to get out to those things, it can be really useful because you'd get a chance to meet a very high number of possible partners in a very short amount of time. So if you have something that you can show, or at least a pitch that you can make, that could help, find, all you need is 1 or 2 that are reasonably excited and interested in following up. And there's a pretty good chance that you may be able to find a partner that can help you and get some funding and things like that. The other part is, of course, privately, so you could try to reach out through family, friends, friends of friends. Things like LinkedIn is a really good resource as well, reaching out to various contacts. Again, depending on how large the team is, you may not need a lot of money to keep you kind of going at the size that you're at until you get to a point where you have a really good demo or first playable a vertical slice, something along those lines that you can kind of then take for out to more serious money. So those are all, again, fairly traditional options of figuring out how to get some additional funds and kind of keeping you going. But probably the more exciting ones is there's definitely, I think, a lot more interest now in games, and I think there is a few crowdfunding and private funding sources that are relatively new, but they're geared specifically for games. The last one I can think of is maybe there are also kind of incubator spaces, which I don't know if it's appropriate for you guys where you're at, the stage that you're at right now, but I know, like, for example, there was one in Montreal called Execution Labs, which I think they've now wrapped up, but there's a few of these similar ones where they have a kind of co-located space where you would actually work from there along with a bunch of other teams. You get access to mentors and folks that can come in and help you out, and then there's also, they have funding as well for the teams that they feel have a good chance of success and so forth. So, and for the most part, it is pretty much like you would get to still keep all the rights to your game and all that kind of stuff, right? So those, I think, are all probably good options to maybe consider. I'm not sure if there is something local to you.
There are a few things that we've looked at, and there is one called the UK Games Fund, which is something that's pitched to us as graduates quite often.
Okay.
The transfuser route, where you get given 25 grand to make a game if you win it.
Yep. That's cool.
That's kind of one of the ways that it's encouraged to us.
Yep. I mean, the other part is, again, you're looking to probably do things to see how you can raise your exposure and kind of getting your name out there, or people being aware of your game. So participating in game jams, Indiecade, and those kinds of events and things like that is a really good way to do it as well.
That's kind of what
just to kind of get people excited about it. Plus, again, you have a good source of user testing where you can have people play the game and give you feedback, but it's a nice way to get awareness for the game too.
That's kind of what I aim with the Manchester Gamers Unite, is that people come down and they play it already. As I say, the game's only been in production for 4 months and people already have an idea of what it is. And same with our social media, we kind of do weekly dev diaries and stuff, which I cannot wait to release in bulk.
Yep.
Yeah, and we do stuff like that, kind of like what BioWare did with its like behind the scenes sort of stuff, like when you brought the voice actors in, like the fan voice actors, or when you did your dev diaries of Forge and the Inquisition Sword and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
That's kind of
awesome.
That's kind of the aim. We were going round and stuff like that. I'm more than happy to go into detail in it a moment anyway, because that kind of marks the end of the interview. The recording.
Excellent.
Yeah. So thanks for recording that. I'll have a chat with you in a moment. And so yeah, that's the end of the recording. Thanks for everyone who stuck around for the full hour. All right.
Excellent.
Bye.
Happy to be here.